Coming up with the NBA Finals likely concluding in near fashion, we take our look at Nic Claxton and how the free agency pool could get muddied very quickly, forcing them to pivot to draft prospects in the 2024 upcoming roster. We take a look, diving in next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Marmbrecht. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know, this episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use promo code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. And Doug, while we assume the finals will conclude shortly, while we assume the Nets can re-sign Claxton imminently, there's also this world where a thin market creates a bit of a problem for the Brooklyn Nets in free agency.
Oh, we were denied the chance from Sean Marks to call Nic Claxton at 12:01 on Thursday evening or Friday evening with the chance to the exclusive free agency negotiation window, which I always find to be the biggest joke in the world. Like, these guys haven't been talking for absolutely forever about some of this stuff, but rules
Nick,
are rules.
And haven't spoken to you at all. Don't know what you've been up to this summer. But interesting.
Someone get me Nic Claxton's phone number. It's 12:01, right? Yeah. So I always find it funny, but those are the rules of the rules, and that's how everyone's gonna just pretend like this is how it works. But with the negotiating window opening, and the Nets have an exclusive window because he's already under contract with the Nets, we expect that maybe this to be one of the first pretty big dominoes to fall in free agency, and it could have a ton of impact. I mean, just going back and signing him and figuring out what the number is, and if that happens quickly, we'll talk about that at length.
Mm-hmm.
If it doesn't happen quickly, we'll talk about what that could mean. If it doesn't happen at all, is kind of what we're going to talk about today, which is how the Nets end up maybe possibly pivoting out of a situation where Nic Claxton is their center. I don't think it's likely, but I don't think it's 100% chance he resigns either, right? And if the market is getting a little bit more robust here, then there's worlds where they're priced out, or he just sees greener pastures with a better team. There's ways this can shake out here.
Well, and you mentioned it there about like, hey, if we basically get pretty quick news that he's re-signed with the Brooklyn Nets, and we won't have time to stress about whether or not. But it does feel like if the timeline starts to extend, then it is the idea of your Nic Claxton. It's not just about the money, but maybe it is also about the opportunity, because he's lived through the life cycle as a Brooklyn Net. When it was pre-superstar era, he's a young developing player. They get superstars, all of a sudden he's a defensive player of the year candidate. They lose the superstars, and all of a sudden it's, geez, I mean, Nic Claxton, is he even that good? So I think, like, he's still young enough. A 4-year contract now, he can still sign another 4-year contract after that. So he may be thinking about it in the long-term picture. And it does feel like if you don't hear it quickly, then it should make you at least take a moment or two and go, okay, so what are the rumors that we're hearing? And there are several teams that could be interested. We've heard from OKC being in the waters, maybe. We've also heard that the Pistons want to come after him, and they have limitless funds this offseason. So there is this world where we start to get clarity on price point, maybe, and that can come back to Brooklyn and how far they're willing to go to keep Claxton.
Yeah, and I again, if I were to make a bet right now, 8:07 a.m. on Monday morning, June 17th, I would make a bet that he's back in back in New York in a Brooklyn Nets uniform. But it is one of these situations where, like, he and Hartenstein are going to kind of dictate this center market, and these guys are going to be coveted. Like, if you watch how the playoffs have kind of shaken out for different reasons, like, these guys, I mean, I think Claxton, like, as a switch defender with, like, in a scheme where they have, like, really good on-ball guys, every team could talk themselves into Claxton for sure. Yeah. Right. And Hartenstein, for like a different reason, like, played high leverage playoff minutes, slightly different, but was also a great rim protector. Also just, like, really good with the ball in his hands on offense. Is sort of like a, just a short roll kind of guy. Like, there's just lots of teams can see that working in the playoffs, and they just saw it. So it's just not going to be, I don't think it's just the Nets set it and forget it. Like with Cam Johnson, I think we thought it was like set it and forget it, right? It was like, and he's coming back. There's just like, whatever, like maybe one other team's interested. I just don't think that's the case here. I think that Claxton had a down year, but it really wasn't things that would influence some other teams that probably see the overall potential.
And the problem there too, might be, I'm curious, and I do believe that he will be back as well. But if the Brooklyn Nets try to, it doesn't seem like we've heard any sense of that, try to play a quote down year, as you say, for Nic Claxton against him in these negotiations when they've been a bad team, that could also be something that sours it. And you mentioned a name there in Isaiah Hartenstein, and you also had a Freudian slip about back in New York when it came to Nic Claxton.
Yeah.
There is and you said at the top, cascading effect here. So the order of how these things happen is also going to make it fascinating, because just like Claxton, Hartenstein is a player for different reasons that teams may look at. Let's say OKC jumps out and goes, we want him, and they steal him away from New York. Immediately, if you want to have I think, worst doomsday scenario for Brooklyn Nets fans everywhere, it would be that the Knicks lose Isaiah, and they immediately look across town and go, well, I tell you what we got over there is a versatile defender, rim runner player who has established himself in that vein, especially on the defensive end of the floor. Now, whether or not that would be the reason the Nets should go, we'll give you whatever you want, don't go over there. It's just fascinating that depending on who goes first here, depending on what teams make a big offer to which player first, that may either expedite the process for the Nets and Nic Claxton, or it could maybe deter them. Like I mentioned Detroit before, and they go, all right, it looks like these numbers are just getting into a place that it wouldn't make sense for us to be committed, even in the short term, over 2-3 seasons.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too. It's like, where do we think the money is going to be? Is it going to be like in that $20 million a year range? It seems like it is going to be $25 million a year. Maybe you're starting to push the limits on like sort of what he offers. He's a really good center. If the Nets are building toward a timeline of they think they're going to grab a superstar, like Claxton's a good ad. It's a little trickier with him just because he doesn't pair with every superstar. And this gets a little weird with this kind of stuff. It's like, does he pair with Giannis? Like, not really, right? I mean, it would be like incredible on defense, but offense, it might be problematic, right? Like that Brolo thing works in Milwaukee because he can stretch the floor and hit threes and corner threes, like when Giannis is just punishing the basket, like Claxton. So it's like the fit isn't super, super clean with him if you're trying to target, like every single guy in the spectrum, but like he can also play in a system that like plays in the playoffs. Like, so I think that it can kind of go both ways with this with Claxton. And this will be fascinating. Again, like this might just be over quick, right? It might just be Nets pay the top dollar. They're incentivized to keep these guys in. They have this vision of sort of how things are going to work out. They think the Clowney Claxton pairing is going to work, like whatever, right? I think there's worlds where this is just done and done. And this podcast is, deprecated really, really fast, but it is crazy, man. Like it could just quickly go the other way, and we're having all kinds of different kinds of conversations.
And if it does go that other way, where Nic Claxton is not a Brooklyn Nets upcoming season, and the Nets do get themselves back into this draft class, are there prospects that, whether in the short or long term, represent value for Brooklyn? We'll start it off with Kal'El Ware coming up here in a second, and seeing, are there replacements in 2024? We'll dive into that in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at LinkedIn. Look, if you're hiring for your small business, you got to find quality professionals that are right for the role. It's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. Those are two words everyone can get behind. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. It's a crazy vast network of more than 1 billion professionals. Makes it the best place to hire. Gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all this while making the process easy, very intuitive. Hiring so easy when you have this many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
All right, so as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about the impending potential free agency for Nic Claxton, does he get out the door? While we think it's more likely he returns than not, there is this world where we turn around and it is the Noah Clowney and Daron Sharp show heading into the 2024-2025 season, which would be interesting, let's put it that way, and probably more of a developmental year. And that's where when we turn over to at least Tankathon or any ranking system you want to use and look at some of these prospects in the first round. I'll bring up Kal'El Ware, 2 different schools that he played at, obviously. Ended at Indiana in his sophomore year, started at Oregon, 20 years old, just barely 20 years old. So we talk about finding that right age range like we discussed with the backcourt players last week. I went with a guy who's already 22 in Carter. That can make it harder to see him fit in. But this feels like a player at 7'1", 230 pounds, who probably still has a bit more to put onto his frame. The antithesis of what the Nets have lacked, right? Size and a little bit of physical presence. Now, there's concerns that he doesn't always show the highest motor and doesn't necessarily seem to be heavily engaged. But from a young prospect standpoint, when you look at his college year over year, only played 16 minutes at Oregon, doubles that up when he goes to Indiana. You see the mid-range game come around here. You see the rebounding ability. And while he only took 40 three-point attempts, that percentage over 40 is at least indicative of a player that has a baseline that you can develop going forward. This is not the perfect prospect by any stretch, but I like the idea of a young guy, 20 years old, that you could say, hey, if we're going this way and it's a developmental season, we can look out to 2025 and maybe see a different type of physical presence the Nets have lacked at that spot.
Yeah, I've seen him like comp to Jared Allen in the past.
Yeah.
He was just like, old friend. And this is, you're getting with Ware a more traditional five. I think that like there's probably a world where the NBA skill set plays it again, like we talked about. I mean, sort of what I talked about before. It's like probably doesn't play with everybody, and like those are always. And my guys kind of like this too. So it's like, this is sort of the trap you fall into yourself. It's like it's a weaker draft. These guys are going to have flaws, especially when you're in the, like, I mean, really everyone in this draft, but like definitely when you get into the teens, you're going to have to tell yourself sort of a story one way, and you can easily tell yourself a story the other way. Traditional five kind of stuff. The NBA, I think the body probably does play in the end. But I don't think the shooting ends up totally coming around, even though he did try to attempt it. I mean, we've seen this kind of like from DaRon, right? It's where it's like, oh, I can kind of see it. He takes him every once in a while, but it doesn't feel like that's ever going to be a huge part of his game. And I think like sometimes at the college, I mean, sometimes at the college level, it's system too. It's like, hey, did you guys run a lot of stuff that was going to be able to get the centers threes? If you don't, then what are they going to do? They're never going to take them on their own. So I think sometimes it's system. With him though, I do think like in terms of like NBA ready to play soon, like that, he would be able to probably step in and play pretty soon. And so I think from that standpoint, athleticism probably going to be there. But again, like body type, wingspan, like overall size, stuff you just can't recreate and can't like get better at. Like you can't take a guy, unless you're Bilal Coulibaly, you can't take a guy from 6'9" to 7 or 7'1" or whatever, right? Like you like once you're 7'1", you just are 7'1", and that matters a lot. And it's just not so versatile. Would you say that? Right? It's it's just not plug and play with every single situation. And those are the only times where I just kind of pump the brakes just a little bit.
Yeah, and I think so. I agree with you on it's the, again, 40 3-point attempts. It's the dream on that that range can grow to that level, not the assume that it gets there. He has a little bit of a mid-range shot, which I think works. So that's like that maybe that area from a DaRon Sharp comparison perspective where you go, well, DaRon is never really looking to take any shot anywhere on the floor. So if you can expand yourself a little bit away from the basket, that's going to benefit a player
Claxton.
Like Ware.
I mean, for that point, like Claxton doesn't take these mid-range jumpers. Yeah, I mean, a lot of centers don't. So, but Claxton's really never gotten there at all. He's gotten better around the rim, but in terms of overall shooting, it's never materialized. And
that's the concern.
So, and you can see it materialize with him too. Like there's a bit more willingness in those different areas, in the different like sort of zones.
Yeah.
To be able to be like, oh, okay, at least there's like some willingness here.
Yeah, and so I mean, I agree with you on that point. And when you talk about, so here's the concerning areas, as you mentioned, not being able to play with everybody. So defensively, again, between Claxton and DaRon Sharp, well, he's a little bit more of a DaRon Sharp, where you'd have concerns the further that you get him away from the basket. So you're saying, okay, you're gonna have to keep him a little bit closer to the paint, try to extend him out towards the perimeter. He's slow-footed, slow-footed by center standards or by perimeter player standards. So he's gonna have a little bit of difficulty probably in that vein. And the other part in terms of developing his shot or developing his value. One thing that I think the Nets should highly value is bigs or players that are going to be in the front court that if fouled can get to the line and knock down some opportunities. The one area that it went the wrong way going from Oregon over to Indiana was the free throw shooting. So the more you get exposed and the more you go to the line. Went to the line 2 times per game in his freshman season, goes 4.5, almost 5 times the following year, drops from 71 to 63%. So, and that's also indicative of perimeter shooting, as we know. It's a good like litmus test there as well. So those two things give you some pause in that way. But in the pullback big picture, it'd be saying, hey, we believe in Noah Clowney. He's going to have a significant role. We kind of like him more as the 4, getting into the 5 in smaller ball lineups. So Noah Clowney, guess what? you do the work. You're going to have to do the switching defense. You're going to have to play out on the perimeter. And we believe that that's part of the value that he brings. So it is recreating the team a little bit in a different way, as opposed to what we talk about with Claxton and Clowney, where it's, hey, yes, we're leaner, but we're also being this type of team that can switch everywhere and really defend out on the perimeter successfully. The thing I think you and I always remember is that the team was supposed to be that last year and couldn't quite always get to that place on the defensive end of the court. So sometimes just having guys that do certain things very well and need help in other areas, that's okay. And where you could see playing early and being a niche role for this team, certainly, especially when they have a lot of young players on the roster.
I always find it funny when like someone's drive and determination is questioned, and like that is a part of this with Ware. But that we've seen that go both ways. Like we've seen this go both ways. This is why I kind of sometimes don't value that kind either way.
Not
value that kind of
doesn't mean that you don't want it and you don't want to play hard. Being demonstrative doesn't mean that you're engaged the right way and executing properly, right?
Well, right. It's one of those things that's like totally subjective. It's like in the eye of the beholder, it's like, looks like he's not trying. I'm like, I don't know. We've seen guys like this all the time. I mean, think about like this was Anthony Edwards. Is like, oh, is he really committed? I was like, I don't know. Seems pretty committed. seems like he's pretty into it, right? And then you guys, the other guys like Anthony Bennett. It's like, was he into it? Nope, not at all. Wasn't even into it a little bit.
It turns out, no,
right? And so
much.
But I guess is like this is one of those ones where it's just a little. It's like a little scout talky for me, as opposed to just like sort of X's and O's, what actually happened on the court. And it's a dangerous one because I think you can sometimes tell yourself, this is the one place where you can tell yourself a story that can be completely wrong. I think a lot of times the other analysis of prospects is it's hard to be so wrong about somebody. The one part you can be so wrong either way is questioning someone's drive or being like the drive's going to make them the whole player. Right. And
tenacious player.
And so I just kind of ignore that, I think, sometimes. And maybe that's wrong. Like, maybe that's wrong. Maybe you don't want, maybe there are examples where it's like, hey, dude, it's so clear this guy's just not into it, right? But I do find that to be the hierarchy of meaningful breakdowns of players that I can, and especially with things I can't see with my own eyes, really, I just kind of ignore that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and frankly, because especially with a lot of prospects like this that have areas they need to work on, I think sometimes that is misidentified as not being engaged, specifically on does he have, the energy, the high motor. It gets labeled as not engaged versus maybe it's a young player that is trying to execute and learn things and needs time to grow in that. You mentioned earlier, maybe it's that he's not being asked to do certain things in certain areas, any player, right? But you end up trying to commit to what you're asked to do, and that can take a little bit of the wheels turning up top rather than just being natural and allowing the game to come to you. So 100%, I would put that far further down the list. Last quick note on him is that the turnover to assist ratio is a little bit in the wrong direction. Tends to have some problems in the turnover game, lapses maybe just in focus in terms of ball control and security, especially when you get down around the paint. You're going to have a lot of active hands in that area. That being said,
it's probably because he hates basketball.
Sorry. Let's check my notes here. One last point was, and he kind of hates basketball and he wants to become a sous chef. So that's that last little note there about Kal'El Ware that I think really matters. Interesting kid, young player, certainly developmental. Coming up on the other side of the break, Doug Norrie has a little bit of a sample of his own that may turn some heads depending on where the price point is in the first round. We'll get to that prospect in just one moment.
Before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. Look, with Prize Picks, you can turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game just watching your favorite sports all summer long. You can make a Prize Pick lineup in as few as 60 seconds. You just need to pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you're locked in right now over on Prize Picks, more or less on what could be this last game between Dallas and Boston. Let's go more on a couple of these guys. Let's go more 24.5 points for Jaylen Brown. Let's go more than 32.5 for our friend Luka Doncic. Let's go less than 23.5 for old friend Kyrie Irving. And I think that's going to be the path to Boston taking this one down. Look, this is all so easy over at Prize Picks. It's daily fantasy made so easy. You just go more or less on all those Prize Picks projections. You're not going against, sharks in the water. You're not going against different salary types. It's just you versus the Prize Picks projections. You call it a day. Download the app today. Use the code LOCKEDON for a first deposit match up to $100. Once again, download the Prize Picks app. Use the code LOCKEDON. First deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy.
All right, so as we wrap up today's Locked On Nets episode, a reminder that last week we talked about some backcourt players that the Nets may want to take a look at, and certainly options if they get back into this draft, but it does depend on when they get into the draft, Doug. We talked about the Kings and the 13th overall pick and a Dorian Finney-Smith trade. If they end up a little bit further in the back end of this draft, which is likely for playoff teams that want to make a little tweak potentially, who do you have on your board as being a nice prospect with some of that upside?
Yeah, so DaRon Holmes, DaRon Holmes is second. Don't want to just get him confused
Come on
with his
now.
father. They won't be drafting. Look, junior out of Dayton. And I want it's lower on the draft board here, but we want to be realistic, right? Like the whole point in breaking down prospects is like, hey, maybe they lose out on Claxton. Let's go for Klingon. Yeah, it's like they're not getting there, right? Let's go for Sarr. Okay, they're not getting there with some of these picks. So we got to go a little deeper in the draft. And I do think for guys that kind of maybe possibly check the Sean Marks box of, undervalued guys in a draft, I think Holmes really gets there. Now, it depends where you look, right? He's mocked anywhere from like 17 all the way to in the 40s, right? So there's a wide range, which is an interesting thing because it's like this is a very, very wide range and it kind of actually probably depends on what you value. If you value young age and unlimited upside, he's going to drop, right? If you value kind of see what I'm getting with him, I think he rises up a little bit. If you feel like you can be flexible, that because he's not exactly a 5 because he's a little small, like then he's going to go up. But if you need a strict 5 here, he's going to go down. So anyway, my point being, he's not overwhelmingly big. He's only 6'9", 6'10", 7'1" wingspan. He's got the frame pretty much at like plus 230. Maybe he puts a little bit more muscle on. But just to start, like I'm giving you examples of why I think there's a wide range on where he lands, right? Because the people that like him really like him. and then the people that don't, I've told them so story. It's like little too old, doesn't translate as a center, not everything gets there, and now you're in the second round. So overall, though, the things that I really like about Holmes, and I actually would value him higher, and especially for the Nets, one, I think he can come in and play pretty quickly. Two, let's say they lose on Claxton, and you're looking for a situation where you can be versatile between the 4 and 5 and be able to do a lot without having a true center, he fits the mold. He shot really well on pick and pop threes and catch and shoot threes last year. And if you look at the shot profile too, a lot of them were enough above the break and enough from well beyond the college line to feel really, really good that that's going to translate. The shooting's improved every single season. He was 59% in his free throw percentage his first year at Dayton. Second year gets up to 67. Last year gets up to 71 on almost 9 free throw attempts a game. He got fouled a ton, because he takes it at the rim a lot, right? Even when he was in pick and pop situations where the three-pointer didn't materialize, he felt comfortable enough putting it on the deck and getting to the rim. The other thing that improved was the three-point shooting. I mean, I'm not even going to count the first year, 14%, never took them. Then sophomore year, takes him a little bit more, 32%. Then it goes up to 2.5 threes a game and shoots him at 39% last year. And if you're telling yourself a story about a guy who the shooting could translate and he could pair with Clowney, and now you have a 4 and 5 that can defensively switch everything and work from beyond the perimeter, it works, man. It works. Yeah. It's like a nice story to tell yourself.
And frankly, between these two prospects, wherever they're going to fall inside the draft, to me, Holmes is the more interesting or more intriguing prospect from a Brooklyn Nets standpoint, from a fit standpoint, and from a flexibility standpoint. You mentioned it there. If you're not going to have high-end talent on your roster, then you better have versatile talent on your roster. Something we thought we had more of maybe over this last season and a half after the deadline, but they really didn't. So Holmes, and you mentioned it too, the other thing comparing him going back to Ware is, well, year over year, it's gotten better for Holmes. You mentioned 3-point shooting. So you finally get the volume. Well, that's where the rubber meets the road. And you go, oh, yeah, well, he shot 2.5 times a game. And guess what? He shot 30%. Not a great outlook. But in this instance, free throw and 3-point shooting, both going in the right direction, gives you the idea that he can play off of that a little bit. And
by the way, real quick with that too, part of that was system. So sometimes it's hard to fault guys for the systems just didn't want to encourage it. At Dayton, the system did encourage it. So now part of that could be system. Part of that could be they just saw he could do it. So it's like a little sometimes hard to tell which came first, like which is the chicken, which is the egg. But one of the main reason, he's not creating 3-pointers for himself off the dribble outside the arc. They ran pick and pop stuff a lot for him, probably because they knew he could make it, but also it was part of their core system. So I'm giving him credit for being able to do it, but I also don't want to like sometimes give people don't get credit for not doing it when the system doesn't allow it. Does that make sense? Like that was my one caveat there.
It's like sometimes when you see a prospect, you go, well, yeah, he's athletic and he can, it looks like he could run the floor, but you didn't see a lot of instances where he got out in space and was given the ball and able to use his athleticism. Can he not do it? Well, that's just, you didn't see that he could. It doesn't mean that he can't. And in this instance, maybe Holmes gets to showcase some of the best of what he is. And when you go and you watch his highlights, I mean, listen, the other part of this would be, if we're comparing not just these two prospects, but the mold of player, the Nets have not been an athletic team. So athleticism should be, for Brooklyn, maybe more than other teams, viewed as a premium in a lot of ways. When you're a young team, sometimes your best avenue to have success is to be able to get out and run the other team into the ground and say, we're going to get out in space. And when you watch Holmes, I will say, when he gets the ball in transition or off of rebounds or even off of makes, he does seem to have the ball handling and the footwork to be able to work his way through the paint, navigate a couple of defenders that are between him and the basket, and finish at the rim, right? In a way that I think every once in a while Claxton flashes that, but you never see it consistently as a part of what the game that he does. Much more fluid is Holmes in terms of that aspect of the game, which we know the Nets value, being a team out in transition and moving at pace.
And I agree with you, and he can do it, and he actually did try, right? Like when he got closed out on hard on the pick and pop stuff, he would try. It's also against lower level college defenders, it's Dayton. They're not playing the absolute, top tier guys here, and sometimes there was some stuff you look at, you're like, that wouldn't work. Right. And I thought this about, we said this about guys in the past.
Get away with that.
We said this about multiple guys in the past before. Sometimes we've been right, sometimes we've been wrong. I'm trying to think. We said, Chris Murray is one guy we said about this. That I was like, this is not going to work at the NBA level. The stuff that worked. Now he did end up playing a lot with the Blazers, but I was like, this stuff that is working in college is not going to work in the NBA level. Like it's just whatever. And so this is a different situation, but we have said this before. It's like, it looks good on tape when the guys are going to be accountants next year. Right. Like but when they're going to be NBA players, it's a different situation. You got to kind of train your eyes a little bit to be able to see the difference, but there was willingness to do it at least. And I think that does count.
Two things I want to mention here before we close out. One, that obviously the impending free agency for Nic Claxton, as we've talked about, we believe it's far more likely he's back than not, but it doesn't mean things can unfold in a way that the Nets get priced out of keeping Claxton around. The other part is where these guys make sense. So we're going to come back in. There's another player here closer to the top 20 there in Filipowski out of Duke. We talked about Carter last week from the same school. We'll probably touch on him along the way ahead of the draft. But in these two players, you mentioned Holmes. Yes, you like him. He's intriguing. But where is the price point here? Like, as I always find it fascinating in the draft, if you believe in a player at 28 and you get into the first round at 20, okay, you got to tell me that there's 4 or 5 other guys that you believed in more than him. At some point, you go, I like this prospect. I believe it. I'm going to take him. How far back do you want the Nets to get into the first round to be comfortable taking Holmes?
Oh, you mean like where could they realistically trade to get him? Is that
like what's the cut? Yeah, what's the cutoff? I mean,
mid-20s probably does it.
They got to look at a totally different class of prospect probably than Holmes.
Yeah, mid-20s probably is probably comfortable. And what's interesting there is too, it's like it works out sometimes. See, the problem with trading into the we really got to get out of here. But like the problem with trading into the lottery, let's say for the Nets, is the guys that they have to trade, like let's say Dorian Finney-Smith, are sort of like win now players. Unfortunately, the teams in the lottery aren't always win now teams.
Yeah.
When you get into this back half of the first round, you get a few more teams into the mix that just are trying to win now, and drafting is not as big of a priority. And it becomes a little more realistic to make the trade because those teams. Because you're like, I mean, this is an example, but right, it's like, this is a terrible example, but it's like, maybe the Spurs. It's like, well, they have no use for these guys. They don't want to win with an older veteran right now. So we don't even need to make the trade. There's many more examples of trades to be made the lower you get, because those teams are playoff teams that might be a wing defender away from like telling themselves a story. So that's just the only reason it's a little more realistic too.
Very quick note as we get out the door. We're going to start to then hierarchy our boards here. We've now given you 4 prospects. We're going to 6, 8, 10 prospects, and we're going to lay out where we think these guys should be in terms of the Brooklyn Nets and getting back in the mix. And that's just something we're working towards as the draft approaches later this month.
All right, much appreciate everyone rocking with us. I'm sure we're probably going to end up doing another Nic Claxton episode tomorrow, is my guess. Just in case one way or the other.
When the news breaks, baby.
Yeah, we wanted to get out in front of it a little bit. As always, make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets over on YouTube. Subscribe to Locked On Nets wherever you listen to podcasts.
Your self-worth is determined by you. You don't have to depend on someone telling you who you are. And that is Beyonce.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We're back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball.